guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. Today we're going to talk about chapter titles. Now there is no reason why you absolutely have to or absolutely can't use chapter titles. I've had several writers ask me if they should be using them or if it's okay to use them. It's always okay to use them, but there's really no circumstance where you have to use them, so it's really just up to your own discretion and what you prefer as the writer, and if you think it suits your style and your book. There are a few reasons why you might want to use chapter titles. The first is if you're writing a children's book. Chapter titles are certainly very common in children's literature, though it's by no means required. I think that chapter titles can sometimes help kids to maintain focus, or at least that is the idea behind the chapter titles, but it is again not really necessary to do so, but it might be a circumstance where it makes sense to use chapter titles. Another reason you might want to use chapter titles is to create an old-fashioned or a nostalgic feeling, because chapter titles were certainly a lot more common in the past than they are today, and it can give that sense of reading a children's book or of reading an older book, and that may suit the style or tone of your novel depending on what you're going for. Another reason you might want to use chapter titles is because your novel is in nonlinear order. Because chapter numbers sort of imply some sort of chronology or chronological order that events are happening in a certain way, it can be helpful at times to avoid numbers and to use chapter titles instead. You will see this fairly common in nonlinear novels, but again, it's not required that you do this, but the chapter titles can replace the numbers, and sometimes that can feel a little bit more authentic or natural in a novel where there's a lot of jumping back and forth in time. Now that we've gone over a few reasons why you might use chapter titles, let's go over what chapter titles achieve. So one thing that can be achieved by using chapter titles is raising a sense of mystery or intrigue about what will happen in the chapter. A good example of this is in The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. One of the chapters is called The Cry in the Corridor, and this raises questions about who's crying, and it has a very mysterious vibe to it that gets the reader excited to keep reading. So even at a glance, even before they've read the first sentence or paragraph of the chapter, maybe they even turn from the last chapter and we're going to put the book down, but they see this title, The Cry in the Corridor, and they're very intrigued and want to continue reading. Another good example of this technique is in Geek Love by Katherine Dunn. She frequently uses chapter titles that get the reader excited and interested in what's going to happen in the chapter. For example, Chapter 3, Meltdown, diving into teacups from the 13th floor and other stimulating experiences, and Chapter 11, Blood Stumps and Other Changes. These chapter titles get us excited about what's going to happen, and they raise a lot of questions, and that can encourage the reader to keep reading. Chapter titles can also pull the reader in by promising the contents of the chapter, and this is a very simple, straightforward way that doesn't really say a whole lot but still gets the reader excited. For example, in Half Magic by Edward Eager, the first few chapters are titled How It Began, What Happened to Their Mother, What Happened to Mark, and What Happened to Catherine. So these are very simple chapter titles, but they get the reader wondering what did happen to Catherine, what did happen to Mark, and even though it's a really simple hook and it's repeated multiple times, that promise of new information and that promise of plot development gets the reader excited to keep reading. Another example of fairly simple chapter titles is in Pippi Longstockings by Astrid Lindgren. In this novel, Chapter 4 is simply titled Pippi Goes to School, and while that isn't a particularly catchy or intriguing chapter title, it works very well because the reader knows who Pippi is and what her personality is like, so we know that we can count on some probably wild antics happening at school, and something really intriguing and interesting is going to happen in the chapter, and we can just base that on our prior information about the character. Chapter titles can also be used to promise information to the reader, which can be an effective way to get the reader wanting to continue reading. A good example of this is in Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close by Jonathan Safran Foer. There are several chapters that are titled Why I'm Not Where You Are, and each of these chapters seek to give a little bit more information, and even though the same chapter title is reused, it's effective at getting the reader engaged because the reader wants that additional information and wants to know more about the situation. Another good example of this is in The Thing About Jellyfish by Ali Benjamin. There's a chapter that's called How to Send a Message, and based on the reader's prior knowledge of this novel, that's a very catchy and exciting chapter title because the two main characters in this novel promised each other that they would send a message if one of them started to act like a mean girl, and one of them surely does start to act like a mean girl, and several times it's foreshadowed that this message is going to be sent, and we know finally we're going to learn how the character decides to send a message to her friend that she has become a mean girl. So there's a sense of payoff there, and a sense that we're finally going to get information that we really want to know, which is what this character does to this other girl to send the message. So I hope this video gave you some ideas for how you can use chapter titles in your own novel. Again, it's totally up to you if you want to use chapter titles, and this was by no means an exhaustive list of techniques. I just wanted to get you guys thinking about how you can use chapter titles creatively in case it's something you do want to try in your novel. So I will be back next week with a video about successful query letters. We'll be looking at some real-world query letters that actually worked. And I will also be back with a video about plotting and how to move quickly from idea to outline. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. Happy writing, guys!